Good morning, ladies and gents. Thanks for tuning in to the Pod Squad. The name's trademark, by the way. Today, your hosts are Safiyah, Jen, and Rosanna. Grab a bowl of popcorn because historical tea is about to be spilled.
The growth of the civil rights movement can be traced back to some specific events that occurred in 1950. The Great Migration, NAACP's help, and Rosa Parks were all successful events that helped further the fight for equality. The movement within the civil rights movement was the Great Migration, where blacks traveled up north to get jobs and gain more economic opportunities. Even though it started in 1916, it was very significant during the 1950s because it strengthened the black vote and their community overall. The migration of blacks helped advance the movement because as African Americans realized there was a less oppressive way of life, they went back to the South to fight prejudice. The strengthened black vote is similar to today's prejudice against immigrants, mostly Mexicans. As more Mexican immigrate to the United States, they are able to influence the Latino vote category in elections. In the most recent election, 66% of Latinos voted for Hillary Clinton, making up the majority. In Truman's election year, he accumulated 77% of the black vote. A big organization that played into the growth of the civil rights movement was the NAACP. They were made up of blacks and white liberal reformers and were first created in 1909. During the 1950s, the problem activists were trying to fix was the inequality between black and white schools. However, Thurgood Marshall led NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund and fought in the legal case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. The concept of segregated schools by race were now considered unconstitutional and was an enormous accomplishment for the movement. This case was a big step in the right path for blacks. Black students were not allowed to integrate in the white system and were expected to get the same level and quality of educations as whites. Calling a law unconstitutional sounds very familiar to most recent events. Donald Trump's Muslim ban was challenged by states after they believed it was unconstitutional. In segregated schools, blacks were discriminated against when the conversation of integrated schools came up. Muslim refugees were targeted when the United States debated about the country's homeland security. In both situations, there are groups being targeted and labeled. Speaking of segregation, Rosa Parks, a black seamstress, is now a civil rights icon due to her courage on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She refused to give up her seat to a white man after he asked her to move to the back of the bus. After her encounter on the bus, the black community started to boycott the bus system and white businesses. The boycott was led by Martin Luther King Jr. and lasted more than a year. This rude encounter and boycott was seen again recently with the man who was beaten up on United Airlines. The doctor was asked to leave the airplane after they realized they were overbooked, but he kindly rejected their offer. He was then beaten up by some of the staff and dragged off the plane. This is similar to Rosa Parks' experience because she was arrested for refusing to go to the black section of the bus. As you can see, the Great Migration, NAACP's help, and Rosa Parks were some reasons why the civil rights movement grew like it did. These events were extremely successful and were big steps to equality.
The policies and methods used to expose suspected communists within the U.S. during the Cold War reflect the nation's tendency to panic under fear, as exemplified by the wave of fear known as McCarthyism. Let's start with Joseph P. McCarthy, who was a Republican senator. But he wasn't just any senator. He was the notorious man that ultimately caused the nation to panic about the rise of communism. Funny how history repeats itself. I guess the Red Scare didn't cause enough stress. McCarthy was obsessed with exposing communists in the U.S. government and promoted it enough to convince many Americans to have the same distrust. This allowed for many unjust accusations against supposed subversives, and I say that with air quotes. McCarthy's influence was so strong that the government was able to investigate millions of government employees, going as far as to track the books that they read, the unions or organizations that they were a part of, and if they went to church. Even people outside of the government weren't safe. Many were blacklisted based on their political beliefs. After all, books that were too liberal were pulled from libraries. Public workers were required to take loyalty oaths, although many argued the oaths were unconstitutional. However, its constitutionality clearly did not matter with the development of many policies and bills that tolerated McCarthyism. For example, in 1950, the McCarran Internal Security Act allowed the government to supervise submersives in the U.S. Basically, the House Un-American Activities Committee could accuse anyone as long as they had reasonable suspicion. Similarly, the Federal Loyalty Security Program was created by Truman to give loyalty review boards ability to fire government employees if it was reasonable to believe that they were disloyal. If you're having some major deja vu right now, I don't blame you. Just as McCarthy would accuse anyone without solid proof, multiple black citizens have been shot by police officers unreasonably. In recent years, the Black Lives Matter movement has risen as innocent victims have been targeted, like Michael Brown. The Black Lives Matter movement shines light on the lives of the black community to prove that all lives do not matter until Black lives matter. In Michael Brown's case, and many others, he is shown obliging by the police officer's orders and does not fight back. This shows that the police officer abused his right to defend himself with a weapon, similar to how anti-communists caused many people to lose their jobs with false accusations. In addition, America exemplified its tendency to panic under fear in World War II with the Japanese internment camps. Although Japanese people were living in America and had nothing to do with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans felt the need to force innocent people to abandon their homes. Like during the Cold War, the government was allowed to do whatever to the Japanese people if they had reasonable suspicion. Unfortunately, as told in Fort Miners, Kenji, it seems as though the government locked up the Japanese for anything they did. Evidently, McCarthyism is only another instance in which the United States compromised order, liberty, and justice at the expense of hysteria caused by fear.
The 1950s was in many ways a period of conformity with traditional gender roles. Mass media enforced strict ideas of gender roles and domesticity largely through the popularization of televisions along with societal pressures. During World War II, many women took over the jobs of the men that left for war. After the war ended in 1945, however, millions of women were displaced by returning soldiers. Women were encouraged by mass media to give up these jobs and return to the domestic life they lived before. There were many attempts to spread the message of the ideal woman, one that stays home to satisfy the needs of their children and their husbands. These women would keep the family unit strong, which was thought of as absolutely essential to a prosperous society, especially during the Cold War. Actually, a husband often found it demeaning for his wife to be employed. Also, many women chose to stay away from the workplace if financially possible, to stay home with their children. Because there was such a strong push for women to return to domesticity, there was different ways that society attempted to strengthen gender roles. By 1957, there were 40 million TVs in America. In fact, you were more likely to find a TV in someone's house than a refrigerator. The popularization of the television brought an extremely new and effective source of communication and entertainment that defined the culture of the post-World War II era. Along with TV came the popularization of situation comedies, or sitcoms, that people could enjoy in the comfort of their own homes. Some shows promoted the important values of domesticity, like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Shows like these painted a perfect picture of the ideal family and the very different roles of men and women. Both of these shows consist of white suburban families with a stay-at-home mom, a dad with a white-collar job, and children. In an episode of Leave It to Beaver, Ward, the father, has a conversation with his son Wally, in which he explains that a woman's place is in the home, and if she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen, while men should be left to do the more difficult tasks. This shows that Ward conforms to the ideals of his time by teaching his son about gender norms. Also, in Father Knows Best, to solve a dispute between their two children, the mother and father tell the boy to do the more masculine task, and the girl to do the cleaning for the boy. This situation shows the mother and father being moral guides to the children and conforming to the ideals of their time by encouraging the children to follow gender norms. The main goal of these sitcoms was not entertainment, but to spread ideas of domesticity and to encourage women to give up their jobs. The hope was that these women would look up to the mother figures in these shows and see how easy and enjoyable their lives could be if they stayed away from the workplace and let the man do his job for the family. Another popular show in the 1950s was I Love Lucy, which portrayed the average housewife. In every episode, Lucy is met with disaster when she tries to pursue a job opportunity or anything that takes her outside of the home. This again reinforces the beliefs of a woman's place in society. However, despite attempts by mass media to influence gender roles, it may not be fair to characterize the 1950s strictly by conformity. Sure, many men and women decided to follow gender norms, but discontent with the status quo can be seen in this time period. For example, many women decided to stay in the workforce when men returned home after World War II, and thus made up a significant proportion of the post-World War II workforce. As the 1950s progressed, women began to recognize gender inequality in the media, which gave rise to the women's movement of the 1960s. Going back to the previously mentioned TV shows, in Leave It to Beaver, the mother says to her son that women are just as ambitious as men and they can have very important jobs. This is a response to her son saying that women have it easy and do not have to worry about being smart because they can just get married. Also, in I Love Lucy, even though a disaster occurs every time Lucy tries to pursue something outside of the house, the fact that she continues to try in every single episode shows that she is no longer content with being at home. Women were starting to realize their worth and that their contributions to society were just as important as a man's, which was beginning to be represented by mass media. These ideas would eventually lead to the women's liberation movement in the 60s, so even though these shows attempted to create the image of the ideal woman, they also represented at times women's desires to break free from gender norms and show their true potential. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pod Squad. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on topics related to the Cold War and the 1950s. Tune in to our next episode where we will go more in depth about the women's movement